What does it take for a man to see the weight of his actions? Not in the mirror of his own pride, but in the eyes of those he's wronged. In the small town of Crestwood, where the air hung heavy with unspoken divisions, Officer Daniel Hargrove believed he knew the answer. He was a man of routine, his badge a shield, his authority a hammer. For years, he patrolled the streets with a certainty that the world was black and white, good guys and bad, law and chaos. But on a sweltering July afternoon, in a courtroom buzzing with tension, that certainty would unravel, thread by thread, until it lay bare the fragility of his convictions. The day began like any other in Crestwood's municipal courthouse, a squat brick building that smelled of old wood and older grudges. Hargrove stood at the back, arms crossed, his uniform crisp despite the heat. He was there to testify in a minor case of traffic violation that had spiraled into an arrest when the defendant, a black woman named Maya Ellison, had questioned his authority. To Hargrove, her defiance was a spark in dry grass, threatening the order he swore to uphold. He'd cuffed her, his grip tighter than necessary, and now he stood ready to paint her as the aggressor. The courtroom was half empty, a scattering of locals fanning themselves with folded papers, their whispers a low hum of anticipation. Maya Ellison entered, her presence commanding despite the handcuffs. She was in her early 40s, her hair pulled back in a neat bun, her eyes sharp and unyielding. Hargrove barely glanced at her, his mind already scripting the story he'd tell. She'd been belligerent, non-compliant, a danger to the public. He'd heard her kind before, too loud, too proud, too unwilling to bend. As she took her place at the defendant's table, he leaned toward the bailiff and muttered, "Hope she learns her place today." The bailiff, a wiry man with a nervous laugh, nodded without meeting his eyes. The judge's entrance was announced, and the room stood. Hargrove straightened, expecting Judge Whitaker, the usual presiding officer, a man who shared his taste for swift, no-nonsense rulings. But the figure who swept through the door was not Whitaker. It was a woman, her robes flowing like a quiet storm, her skin the same rich brown as Maya's. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He didn't recognize her, but something in her bearing, calm, deliberate, almost regal, set his nerves on edge. She ascended the bench, her gaze sweeping the room like a lighthouse beam, and settled on the case file before her. "Court is now in session," she said, her voice clear and steady. "The Honorable Amara Kendrick presiding." Hargrove froze. Kendrick? The name struck a chord, distant but sharp, like a memory he couldn't place. He shook it off, focusing instead on his testimony. When called to the stand, he recounted the traffic stop with practiced ease. Maya's speeding, her refusal to comply, her raised voice. He leaned into the details, painting her as reckless, defiant, a threat. The room listened, some nodding, others shifting uncomfortably. Maya sat still, her expression unreadable, her eyes fixed on him. When it was her turn, Maya spoke with a quiet fire. She didn't deny the speeding barely 5 miles over the limit, but she described Hargrove's aggression, his refusal to listen, the way he'd twisted her arm as he cuffed her. "Asked for his badge number," she said. "That's when he lost it." Her voice didn't waver, but there was a weight to it, a history of being unheard. Hargrove scoffed under his breath, loud enough for the front row to hear. Judge Kendrick's gavel cracked like a whip. "Officer Hargrove," she said, her tone cutting through the humid air, "you will show respect in my courtroom." He bristled, but nodded, his face a mask of compliance. The proceedings continued, with Maya's lawyer poking holes in Hargrove's story, presenting dashcam footage that showed a calmer exchange than he'd described. Hargrove's confidence wavered, but he held firm, certain the judge would see through what he assumed was Maya's performance. After all, Crestwood's justice system had always tilted in his favor. Then came the moment that shifted the ground beneath him. Judge Kendrick set aside the file and leaned forward, her eyes locking onto Hargrove's. "Officer, you stated the defendant was a threat to public safety. Can you clarify what specific actions justified that assessment?" Hargrove faltered, his rehearsed lines crumbling. She was uncooperative, Your Honor. raised her voice, questioned my authority. Questioning authority is not a crime, Kendrick replied, her voice steady but laced with steel. Nor is it a threat. Did she make any physical moves against you? No, but he stopped, sensing the trap but unable to retreat. It's about the attitude, Your Honor. People like her, they don't respect the law. The courtroom went silent. The words hung in the air, raw and unguarded. Hargrove felt the weight of every eye on him, but none heavier than Judge Kendrick's. She leaned back, her expression unreadable, and asked, "People like her?" He stammered, heat rising in his cheeks. "I meant non-compliant individuals." Kendrick's gaze didn't waver. "Officer Hargrove, do you know who I am?" He blinked, confused. "You're the judge, Your Honor." "I am Amara Kendrick," she said, each word deliberate. "And 20 years ago, you arrested me for loitering outside this very courthouse. I was a law student, waiting for a friend. You called me a troublemaker, said I didn't belong here. Do you remember?" The memory hit him like a freight train. A young woman, defiant, her books scattered on the sidewalk as he'd cuffed her for no reason other than his own frustration. He'd forgotten her face, her name, but not the feeling of power, the certainty he was right. Now, that same woman sat above him, her robes a testament to her triumph over his prejudice. Hargrove's mouth went dry. "I didn't know, Your Honor." "You didn't care," she said, not with anger, but with a quiet truth that cut deeper. "You saw my skin, my youth, and you decided my worth. Just as you've done with Ms. Ellison." The room seemed to shrink, the air thick with the weight of her words. Hargrove's mind raced, searching for an excuse, a defense, but found none. He saw Maya now, really saw her not as a defendant, but as a woman, a person, someone who'd faced the same assumptions he'd wielded like a weapon. "Your Honor," he began, his voice cracking. "I'm sorry. I didn't mean—" "An apology without change is just noise," Kendrick interrupted. "Ms. Ellison's charges are dismissed. Officer Hargrove, I recommend you reflect on the power you hold and the harm it can do when wielded carelessly." The gavel fell, and the case was over, but for Hargrove, it was only the beginning. He left the courtroom, his badge heavier than ever, haunted by the faces of the women he'd wronged, one now free, the other judging not just his actions, but the man he'd chosen to be. That night, alone in his apartment, Hargrove sat staring at his uniform. He thought of his father, a cop who'd taught him to see the world in stark lines, to trust his gut over fairness. He thought of the countless stops, arrests, moments where he'd acted on instinct rather than justice. For the first time, he wondered how many Mayas and Amaras he'd dismissed, how many lives he'd altered with a single choice. The next morning, he drove to the community center, a place he'd always avoided, and signed up for a workshop on bias training. It wasn't redemption not yet, but it was a step. He didn't know if he could undo the past, but he knew he couldn't keep building on its mistakes. In Crestwood, where change came slow, Daniel Hargrove began to learn that justice wasn't just a badge or a gavelet, it was a choice to see, to listen, to grow. Thank you for listening. If you find it interesting, please like and subscribe to follow the next stories.